Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today I got a bit of a weird one for you. Today, yes, we are really going to be talking about a completely tripped out, modified Japanese Panasonic FZ10 3DO. Say that, 4 times fast. But yes, so the point of this video is, obviously everybody knows about the 3DO is the greatest console of all time. You all know it very well. No, I'm just kidding. But it is actually an underrated console, and it's not one that I think gets a whole lot of attention, particularly when it comes to the idea of modifications and upgrades for it. So I happen to be in this weird position where I actually have one that is totally tripped out, and I just wanted to talk about it. But for the record, this is not a video on like how to do these modifications. It's more like I'm just a guy who has one, and I thought, all right, let's talk about what it performs like. Kind of like I did with a hacked Wii U and a hacked Xbox 360. Again, I didn't do those. I just like, hey, once you have one, what's it like to be the end user? And this is the same scenario. So a little bit of history with this particular console. This one came from Japan. One of the times where I was over there, I found this in a junk bin. Now, Japanese junk bins are usually pretty good odds that it's going to work out because their definition of junk is like, there's a little scuff there, so the whole thing is garbage, which means you can't return it, which is fine because usually it works just fine. This happened to be one of the few cases where that wasn't, the situation. I really rescued it, hoping that I could, that it worked, but that, if it didn't, that we could do something. It was only like 20 bucks. Great. Bring it back. Try it out. And the disk drive doesn't work. The controller works, the BIOS works, the video output works, everything else works, it just can't play discs. And I was like, alright, that sucks, but it is what it is. Because even there, you don't really see 3DOs that much. So I just wanted to rescue it. All good. Then I put it off to the side, like right there off screen where you can't see, there's just piles of like things where I'm like, I don't know, it goes somewhere until I figure out a solution later. So there it sat until a couple years later. A buddy of mine named Justin, who runs Power Up Gaming, I'll put a link to his information in the description. He's done mods and repairs and things like that for me in the past. Does really good work. He actually used to work at Limited Run Games. He was like, "Do you have anything you need me to work on or whatever?" And I was like, "I got this 3DO laying around." And he's like, "All right, cool. Hand it to me and I'll work on it." So that happened, and then the pandemic happened, and so it was like priorities changed. The world moves on in different ways. And eventually, he was like, "Hey man, I got some time. I'm gonna work on this 3DO." But he's like, a lot has changed in this time. He's like, I could just repair the disk drive and we could just call it a day. But he's like, I just want you to know there's like a bunch of other crazy stuff we can do. And I was like, what? And he's like, well, he's like, you may not know this, but there is actually an RGB mod for these things. The thing with the 3DO is it only had 2 output options. It had composite and S-video, and that was it. RGB was never built into these things. And he was like, there is an upgrade now, but it's very limited. It only works on the Japanese FZ10, and only some of them. You happen to have exactly that. You have the Japanese FZ10, and you happen to have the version that also is compatible. So he's like, I could totally do that. And I was like, awesome. So that particular mod is a board that was created by Dan Coons. He's the guy who made the DC Digital. Awesome guy. I've talked to him many times. He worked on my Dreamcast and everything. Great guy. He happened to build that particular mod, that board. So Justin goes ahead and gets it. And as he's doing that, he's like, so I want to present you with another idea. The disk drive in this thing is dead. We need to repair it unless you'd prefer to have an ODE. And I was like, okay. So there's an ODE in this thing. Now, for those unfamiliar, an ODE stands for Optical Disc Emulator. It's basically the idea that you take the disk drive itself out and replace it with an entirely new board that replicates the function of the disk drive, but instead of reading actual disks, it reads things through some other medium, whether it be SD cards or flash drives or whatever, and then you put the games on that. That has, obviously you lose the disk drive in that process, but this one didn't work anyway, so it didn't really matter. But then it has benefits like far improved like load times on games and potentially having every single game ever made all on one device. So he's like, we could do that. This Russian dude actually made one. Yes, there are ODEs. People thought there was a need for an ODE on a 3DO, and they were totally right. And if you're thinking like that has to be the most obscure console to ever receive an ODE, because most people think like ODEs, yeah, Dreamcast has one, PS1 has one, Saturn has one, all that sort of stuff. It gets more obscure than this, man. The FM Towns Marty, a console I actively want and cannot find, has an ODE. Just saying. But anyway, so he was like, I can do that. So he goes ahead and he installs the ODE. So at that point, it's got the RGB mod. It's got the ODE. And he's like, now we're just down to the point where we have to pick out some sort of USB device to connect it to. Most people, I think, would probably just go with a flash card or a flash drive, a thumbstick, whatever. He's like, I don't know, you know, a basic size one, put on just a handful of games, probably like Super Street Fighter 2 and a few of the others that the 3DO is better known for, and just kind of call it a day. And I was like, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. So we went to the next level. There's an SSD in this thing. And before I hear a whole bunch of like, that doesn't have a benefit comments on it, just hear me out. I am not completely insane. I recognize that an SSD is ridiculous overkill for something like this. I mean, people call it overkill on an Xbox 360 because it just limits, you know, it's limited to SATA 2 and can't really take advantage of much of the benefits. This is archaic compared to an Xbox 360. So truly, you're maybe using like 5% of the capability of an SSD. I get it. This wasn't about speed. Although it does absolutely max that speed out, and of course you have the benefits of no seek times, whatever. But to be completely real with you, it was mostly about longevity. The read-write cycles on a flash drive are very limited. They're even more limited off of SD cards. But off of an SSD, realistically, unless I abuse it, it probably will not fail in my lifetime. So there was no reason to get like a gigantic one because the 3DO library isn't really that big. So what I kind of did some math, I crunched some numbers, and I thought 128 gigabyte SSD could probably fit the entire 3DO collection. Let's give it a shot. And that was my only mistake because it turns out I was just a little bit off. You know how like when you get a hard drive and it's like, oh, it's 128 gigs, but after you format it, you get like 119 to play with or whatever? That little difference was actually enough to just miss out on the full set. This thing is loaded with the entire American set, all the European exclusives, and all the Japanese exclusives, except, this is going to sound very specific, all the golf games. I don't like golf games. So it's like, if you just remove those, then everything else fits. So my one mistake would have been if I were to redo this, I would get a 256 gigabyte SSD. The thing is, they're not that expensive. 128 gigabyte SSD, it was like 20 bucks, if that. So it's just like, okay, cool. So upon opening it, you can see inside, the SSD is just kind of wedged in there. But amusingly, I did actually have a spare flash drive laying around. This is like an old 2.0 drive. It's like 8 gigabytes, whatever, nothing special. You know, maybe like 6 usable after it's formatted. Easily enough to host all those golf games. So technically it's all there. I would just have to swap that. But there you go. It looks, I mean, I wouldn't recommend keeping it open because it's not the prettiest display when it's open, but when it's closed, look at that. It looks so nice and so stock. But we'll talk about, you know, the performance and all that in a minute. But let's go back and take a look at the RGB mod. So the way the RGB mod on this thing works is that it actually has a switch on the side for 480i and 240p. Now, I don't 100% know why that is. I know that the console natively supported 480i. There actually is no 240p mode in this thing because the 3DO did not support RGB at all. It's not like, say, the Sega Genesis where it has RGB in it and they just never gave you the cables for it. This doesn't exist inside the console. It never did. It's kind of like the NES. The NES does not have anything that is considered an RGB mode. So if you were to modify an NES for RGB, and I've seen this process done, it's very complicated because you have to essentially remove what at the time was called the PPU. I think we would now refer to it more like a GPU. In that case, it was picture processing unit. You remove that from the motherboard, and then you would have to get this extra board, this you know, the new thing that you put in place of where the PPU was, and then put the PPU on top of it. So it's like hat on a hat, but like that process is necessary for the NES to have something it thinks in RGB with. Similar process with the 3DO. The board that was installed essentially works like that. Now the funny thing is, Justin was like, I just followed the instructions and installed it. He didn't really know on like an engineering or technical level why it needs that or how exactly that works. And I don't blame him. I don't entirely know why either, but that's essentially the consensus. Now, the 480i mode, like I said, is the original. 240p mode, I assume, is just because that's traditionally what low-end RGB is in. Like, that's the resolution the Super Nintendo ran at and the Sega Genesis ran at. So you have the option for both. Either way, you'll get RGB. It's just a matter of what resolution output you want. But that said, that comes with a couple of quirks. One of them is 240p is not a resolution that modern televisions typically understand. So if you were to say take this and want to run it through something into like a modern television, you're going to need something like the RetroTink 5X here. I did a video on this not that long ago, or something like the FrameMeister or whatever to adapt for that. But that also gets a tad limiting, not through the fault of this device, but more so this particular modification. Now, Dan Koons is a genius engineer, and he obviously had reasons for doing what he did, but the port on the back, a lot of RGB mods use the Sega Genesis Model 2 9-pin connection, probably just because the cables for it are so prevalent. In this case, Dan didn't do that. He used an 8-pin connection, which is apparently very specific. Nothing natively used it as far as I can tell. So upon doing some research into this, I found out that particular pin set is really only used for things like the 3DO or the NES, where they have no RGB mode and you've just integrated one. There's probably an engineering reason for that. So it's not like I'm sitting here saying like, Dan, why didn't you use 9-pin? Because for all I know, it wasn't possible. It might have only worked with an 8-pin, and that's why he did it. So, that said, there are actually, believe it or not, cables made specifically for people who have this type of modification on their 3DO. And then I thought about it, and I was like, okay, because I got none of those laying around, I guess I got to go buy a set of cables. And I'm reading about it, and that's exactly when it said, oh, it also, you know, it's for NES RGB mods. And then I was like, I have one of those! I actually had an NES RGB modded, that's why I was familiar with the process, like 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember the cable for it being like annoyingly specific to that particular unit. So I went over, I got the unit, I got the cable, and boom, there it was. There was the 8-pin RGB SCART cable. And so I plugged it in, and it worked just fine. The only issue with it is the more modern cables actually have the audio built into this adapter, whereas this particular cable does not. It comes with a separate 3.5mm connection, which would have been a problem, except, oh, what do you know, Panasonic put on separate audio ports, so all I needed was a little adapter, got plenty of those laying around, and then boom, I got video, I got audio, and I didn't have to spend anything to do it. So, fantastic. Now that said, let's talk about what it's like to actually use it. Now for purposes of our testing, I will keep the console in 240p mode, running through the RetroTink 5X in through SCART. And so that's what this looks like. Now when you actually get it, you can see here you're presented with this screen. Now this screen requires a little bit of setup. The folder structure there is the recommended folder structure. However, you can technically change this to anything you want. You could separate it by like sports games, action games, or whatever your preferences are. Or it just would not be recommended to throw the actual games onto the main page, but you could do that too, provided you were keeping it very limited. The reason you create so many folders is really just so as not to bog down the system and to just make it easier to get to the games you want to get. Because if you have too many games on a single page, then the load times will cause problems. So break it up, but break it up however you want. That's up to you. The part that's not up to you is there's a couple of extra files here and there that you can find online and you throw on there that the system needs in order for it to boot correctly, but they're super small and not hard to find at all. So no problem there. Just make sure you do that type of setup. And as I recall, the device had to be FAT32 in order to operate, which is also fine because there is no individual game on the system that exceeds even like 800 megabytes, much less 4 gigs, so there's no problems with that. So all I did, honestly, after the folder structure was set up, is I went ahead and I just grabbed all the games I own. I've ripped all my discs, and then I wanted to put them on there. And then there was also a bunch I didn't have that I went to the high seas of the internet to just go ahead and complete. At this point, 3DO stuff is not hard to find online. It's archived pretty professionally because nobody really claims ownership of it anymore. But one thing that is definitely worth knowing if you're going to be the guy doing this is that I don't know why this is with the 3DO ODE specifically, but it's kind of like the RIA for the Sega Saturn, where everyone rips all the games in bin and queue, because that's the accepted file format for a Sega Saturn or 3DO ISO. However, that's not what the 3DO wants. It wants all your games to be in .iso, which can be very tedious because you essentially have to use things like Ultra ISO and virtual loaders and or virtual CD loaders like Daemon tools or whatever it's called. You have to do all this extra stuff to basically convert every single individual game one at a time from bin and queue to .iso. It's a little tedious. And the other part of that problem is that .iso typically ends up being a little bit bigger than the bin and queue format, which also added up to why all the games didn't quite fit on a 128 gigabyte drive. The math was a little off because of that X factor. That's a lot of the nerdy stuff you don't necessarily need to know. So let's just talk about how it actually performs. Like I said, once you're in there, it's broken up into whatever file structure you like, and then you just go ahead and you click on any folder, and then you scroll to whatever game you want to play. And then once you do, you just click on it, and it boots up. And provided your ISO is clean, it should work just fine. And at that point, you're just playing the game. And the game, in my case, is now loading faster, which is fantastic. It basically maxes out the potential of the 3DO's load speed because it's no longer limited by the disk drive. But you also have that beautiful RGB signal, and man, does that look good. Like, the first time I connected that, I was like, wow, that really, the color pops, it looks fantastic, and it makes sense because it's not just tapping into some hidden thing. It's like a board designed for RGB on the 3DO. Just for comparison's sake, I'm also going to run the thing with the 3DO with composite so you can see what that looks like. As well as eventually I'll take a look at S-Video, but just go ahead and as I continue to talk, just look at the if you're ever confused which footage you're looking at, I'll have it labeled so you can see which is which. But yeah, spoilers, RGB wins. As far as limitations of that particular board, I can't totally say, because like the 3DO is capable of like, there's a module on the side for things like a VCD card support and all that. Obviously, because this one doesn't have a disk drive, nor did it even have a functional disk drive at one point, well, in my possession anyway, there was no way to see if it can play VCDs through that and how those would look, that type of thing. But I don't imagine that would matter much. The majority of the time, if you're using the RGB mod, you're probably just using it for the games. But honestly, I really can't think of anything else to say about it that isn't, it's just very clean, clear signal. ODE works fantastic. I'm sure I'll get made fun of for putting an SSD in it, but I care about longevity, so this thing is like perfect forever, at least in my lifetime. I might go ahead and get a new set of cables for this, only because I don't like being reliant on that audio adapter, but that's a first world problem right there. Looks fantastic with the RetroTink. So I want to give a huge shout out again to Justin. If you want something like this done to your 3DO, it's possible. You'd have to contact him. The problem with these RGB boards in particular is that Dan no longer makes these. So all the ones that are out there are the ones that are out there as far as I can tell. And you, again, unless this is out of date, you still need this particular version of the console. The ODE, I think, is a little bit easier to get your hands on, but again, it's basically made by one dude in Russia when he feels like it. So it may not be the easiest thing, but you can do it. Potentially, this is an option. It does exist in the world if you're the guy who's committed enough to a 3DO to actually take all those steps. But it's very, very nice once it's actually operating. And cool bonus, this thing is one of the consoles that has an access light, like the early Sega Saturns and the Sega CDs. So you actually see the access light flickering and loading while it's loading stuff off of a hard drive, and it's just like, I don't know. It was just neat. So thank you very much to Justin. Please check him out. Link in the description. He doesn't just do this. He does a ton of different modification work. Like I said, he's done stuff for me over the years. And if you want things like the cables, I'll put the link in the description. Not to this particular cable, but to the one that actually, they recommended specifically for that particular mod. And I'll put a link to the RetroTink as well, because why not? But yes, thank you very much to Justin. Please check out the links in the description. Follow me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, the Discord, all that sort of stuff is always appreciated. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.